Robert thought he was the star of the show until he came face to face with a guard who clearly didn't find his jokes amusing. The crowd gasped as the Joker hit the ground. Phones whipped out in seconds, some recording, others dialing for help. But the real nightmare was only just beginning. Let's start from the top. Robert, a 34-year-old real estate agent from Chicago, was the type of guy who thought he could charm his way out of any situation. When he arrived in London, he was instantly captivated by the city's grandeur. The old architecture, the bustling streets, the accents that made even the simplest phrases sound sophisticated. But let's be real, Robert wasn't here for the culture. He was here to make memories, and by memories, he meant stories he could brag about for years. After a long day of exploring, he wandered into a pub glowing with warm lights and buzzing with energy. The place was packed, locals nursing their pints, tourists comparing notes on must-see spots. Robert, ever the social butterfly, slid into a group of rowdy travelers swapping tales about their London misadventures. One guy, an Australian with a sunburn that screamed "too much sightseeing," launched into a story about his failed attempt to make a Queen's Guard laugh. "They're like statues, man. You could do the Macarena in front of them and they wouldn't even blink," he said, earning laughs from the group. Robert smirked, the gears in his head already turning. "Statues, huh? Bet I could do better than that," he said, his tone dripping with confidence. "Yeah, right," someone shot back, rolling their eyes. "No, seriously," Robert insisted, leaning forward like he was about to reveal a master plan. "I'm going to give them a show they'll never forget." Fueled by a couple of pints and the kind of bravado that only comes with an audience, Robert decided this would be his claim to fame. The next thing he knew, he was striding toward Buckingham Palace, the cool London air doing little to sober him up. The towering gates, the iconic guards, it all screamed, "Don't mess with this." But Robert wasn't the type to take a hint. As he approached the palace, he spotted his target, a young guard stationed near the entrance, standing as still and expressionless as the statues that surrounded him. Tourists were scattered nearby, snapping pictures, whispering in awe of the scene. Robert grinned. This was his moment. "All right, folks, gather round," he announced, arms outstretched like a street performer about to launch into his act. A few curious faces turned his way, their cameras now pointed at him instead of the guard. He started small, waving his hand inches from the guard's face, as if testing his resolve. Nothing. The guard didn't even flinch. "Oh, come on," Robert exclaimed, throwing his hands in the air dramatically. "You're telling me this guy doesn't even blink? What are they feeding you people, pure discipline?" The crowd chuckled, some snapping photos of Robert's antics. Encouraged, he took it up a notch, mimicking the guard's rigid stance with exaggerated movements, like a kid doing a bad impression of his teacher. Still, no reaction. Robert leaned in closer, his grin turning mischievous. "Let's see if this uniform is even real," he said, his voice loud enough to catch the attention of every nearby tourist. Without thinking, or maybe thinking too much about the attention he was getting, Robert reached out and gave the guard's sleeve a little tug. In an instant, the atmosphere shifted. The guard took a sharp step forward, his boot hitting the ground with such force that it echoed through the square. The sound alone was enough to make the crowd freeze, their laughter dying on their lips. "Step back immediately," the guard commanded, his voice firm and unyielding. Robert blinked, momentarily caught off guard, but then, as if the seriousness of the moment hadn't fully registered, he smirked. "Relax, man. It's just a joke." The guard didn't move, didn't react beyond the measured intensity of his stance. Robert, oblivious to the growing tension, leaned in slightly, his grin widening. "But seriously, how do they get this thing on you? Velcro? Buttons?" The guard's rifle shifted ever so slightly. It wasn't aimed, but the movement was enough to make the crowd collectively hold their breath. A woman whispered to her friend, "This guy's about to get himself in serious trouble." Robert, however, was still riding the high of the attention, too caught up in his own ego to notice the danger he was stepping into. What he thought was a harmless joke had already crossed the line, and the guard wasn't about to let it slide. The air grew heavier, the tension almost tangible, as Robert stood there, completely unaware that the line between a joke and a disaster was about to vanish. Robert froze in place, his breath catching as he stared down the unwavering face of the guard. For a second, he tried to laugh it off, his voice strained but carrying the last remnants of his fading confidence. "Hey, relax. It's just a joke, man. No need to get all dramatic." But the guard wasn't buying it. His expression stayed locked in that same unshakable, stoic mask. His voice, however, was anything but passive. It cut through the tense silence like a blade. "This is your final warning. Step back immediately, or there will be consequences." That phrase hit differently. The crowd, which moments ago had been chuckling and snapping photos of Robert's antics, now stood silent, their expression shifting from amused to concerned. Someone in the back whispered nervously, "This is about to go south real fast." Robert, however, was never one to back down. His earlier bravado was starting to waver, sure, but the attention, that was addictive. He couldn't just walk away now, not with all eyes on him. That'd make him look weak. So, instead of stepping back, he doubled down. "Come on, what's the big deal? I just wanted to see if your outfit's the real deal." And with that, he reached out again, his fingers grazing the edge of the guard's sleeve. The reaction was immediate and precise, like a spring-loaded trap snapping shut. The guard's arm shot out, deflecting Robert's hand in one swift, practiced motion. The next instant, his other hand pressed firmly against Robert's chest, sending him stumbling backward. It wasn't a casual push. This was calculated, enough force to make a point, but not enough to cause serious harm. Except Robert, unsteady on his feet and still under the influence, lost his balance completely. His heel caught on the uneven cobblestone, and he went down hard. The back of his head hit the ground with a dull thud. For a second, there was nothing but silence. The kind that's so heavy it feels like the entire world has stopped spinning. Then came the gasps, sharp and collective, as if the crowd had been holding their breath and finally remembered to exhale. "Did you see that?" Someone whispered, pulling out their phone to record the aftermath. "Oh my gosh, is he okay?" Another voice chimed in, panicked. Robert, sprawled on the ground, blinked up at the sky, his vision swimming. His head throbbed, and when he reached up to touch his temple, his fingers came away stained red. But pain wasn't the first thing on his mind. No, that spot was reserved for anger. He pushed himself up onto his knees, his face twisted into a mask of fury. "You think you can get away with that?" he snarled, his voice loud enough to make the front row of onlookers flinch. "I'm an American! Do you know what that means? You'll be apologizing to me on your knees by the time I'm done with you." The guard didn't flinch. He didn't even react. He simply took another measured step forward, his stance firm, his rifle now held with unmistakable intent. It wasn't threatening, but it was clear that the situation had escalated to a point of no return. The crowd, sensing the tension, began to murmur nervously. A woman with a stroller hurried away, clutching her child tightly. A man in a sharp suit fumbled with his phone, probably trying to call the authorities. Robert, still seething, started to rise to his feet, his movements slow and unsteady. But before he could take another step, a sharp, piercing whistle cut through the air. Heads turned toward the source of the sound, and Robert glanced over his shoulder to see a group of uniformed palace security officers closing in on the scene. Their expressions were serious, their strides purposeful. The guard didn't move, his posture as unyielding as ever. But Robert, for the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. The reality of the situation was beginning to sink in, but by now, it was far too late to backtrack. Two security officers in sharp black uniforms closed in on Robert like hawks, while a third stepped forward to check on the guard, who stood as immovable as ever. Robert's panic was starting to bubble over, but he wasn't about to let it show, not completely anyway. He puffed out his chest, or at least tried to, and launched into what he probably thought was an impressive tirade. "Do you even know who I am?" he shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "I have rights, you know. This is going to be all over the news by tomorrow. Just wait and see." The words came out loud and rushed, but the confidence behind them was quickly unraveling. His breaths grew shallow, and the color in his face was shifting from defiant red to something closer to pale desperation. A thin trickle of sweat slid down his temple, mixing with the blood already staining his forehead. The crowd, no longer just amused bystanders, now watched with a mix of concern and morbid fascination. Phones were held aloft, recording every second of the unfolding chaos. A hushed murmur rippled through the spectators, whispers of, "Is he okay?" and "This is getting out of hand." But Robert? He wasn't hearing any of it. The pounding in his head was growing louder, each thud echoing in his ears like a drumbeat. His vision blurred slightly at the edges, and the weight of the situation seemed to press down on him all at once. Then, his legs betrayed him. One shaky step turned into a stumble, and before anyone could react, Robert's knees buckled. He swayed on the spot for a moment, like a toppled statue, before collapsing to the ground in an unceremonious heap. The crowd gasped in unison. For a split second, it was so quiet you could hear the hum of passing cars in the distance. Then the commotion erupted. "Somebody call an ambulance," a woman yelled, clutching her handbag like it might help. A man with a phone to his ear shouted, "They're on their way! Stay back, everyone!" Meanwhile, Robert lay motionless, his face pale and blood pooling slightly beneath him. His earlier bravado was completely gone, replaced by the unnerving stillness of someone who had clearly overplayed their hand. When the paramedics arrived moments later, the scene was pure chaos. They worked quickly, carefully placing Robert onto a stretcher, while murmurs rippled through the crowd. One of them pressed a cloth against the gash on his head, while another checked his pulse. The guard, despite being the centerpiece of the entire ordeal, hadn't moved an inch. His face was calm, but the subtle rise and fall of his chest betrayed the slightest hint of strain. As the paramedics loaded Robert into the ambulance, one of the security officers turned to the gathering crowd. "Please clear the area," he said, his tone firm but calm. "This situation is under control." But even as the crowd began to disperse, their curiosity lingered. People whispered to one another, speculating about what had just happened and what would come of it. For Robert, though, the spectacle was over. By the time the ambulance doors closed, he was completely unconscious, leaving behind a trail of questions and plenty of video evidence. What would you have done in Robert's place? Do you think he crossed the line, or was it all just harmless fun that went too far? Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you, or anyone you know, ever experienced or witnessed a similar situation? Don't forget to like and share this story if it resonated with you. This story was created with the purpose of spreading awareness, highlighting the importance of respect, and making the world a better place. Remember, your opinion matters, and together we can spark conversations that lead to positive change.